On this day in 1773, tensions between Britain and its American colonies were at a boiling point. Things would come to a head 9 months later with the famous Boston Tea Party, an event that would change the course of history and help spark the American Revolution. But why did those colonists do it? Hi everyone, and welcome to this house. Today we are exploring the events leading up to the Boston Tea Party. Make sure to hit that subscribe button so you never miss an exciting episode. In 1773, the American colonies were feeling increasingly suffocated by British rule. 4 years, they had been raising their voices against various acts they felt were unjust. However, most of these protests had not been about taxation, but rather about things like the quartering of troops, restrictions on trade and manufacturing, and the general lack of representation in Parliament. That all changed with the Tea Act of 1773. Now, before we go any further, let me just say this. Most people think the Boston Tea Party was a protest against taxes. While taxation was certainly part of the issue, it wasn't really what the Tea Party was about. And I'll explain more on that later. The Tea Act gave the British East India Company a monopoly on the sale of tea in the colonies. Previously, colonists could buy tea from whomever they wanted, but now they would have to purchase it from the British East India Company. Why, you might ask? Well, the company was going bankrupt. To make a long story short, the British government enacted several acts in the 1760s that hurt the economy of the colonies. The colonists retaliated by boycotting British goods, which included textiles, paper, and, yes, tea. This boycott was very effective and hurting the company even more. Parliament decided to enact the Tea Act in order to save the company, even if it meant making the colonists even angrier. So why tea? Why was it such a big deal? Well, for one thing, tea was the one item that colonists imported from Britain. In 1772, the total value of imports from Britain to the colonies was over £4 million sterling. Of that amount, tea made up half of it, over £2 million. Tea was also seen as a luxury good. After all, most people didn't really need tea, they simply liked it. This meant that it was an easy item to cut out of one's budget during hard times, and many colonists did just that. By boycotting tea, they were sending a clear message to Britain: we won't be taken advantage of, and it worked. Between 1769 and 1773, tea imports dropped 85%. But there was another reason why tea was such a big deal. It was expensive. Tea prices had risen 300% since 1769 due to new taxes imposed by Parliament. This meant that for many colonists, tea went from being a luxury good to being an everyday necessity. And when something goes from a luxury good to an everyday necessity, people will find other sources to get it. If they couldn't get it from the British East India Company at a fair price, they would get it from the Dutch or the French. Not only was the Tea Act a bad deal for the colonists, it was also a bad deal for the British merchants who sold tea. For them, the price of tea had gone up, but the price they could sell it for had stayed the same. Many saw the Tea Act as a direct attack on their pocketbooks, and they weren't happy about it. By the end of 1773, colonial anger over the Tea Act was at a fever pitch. Newspapers across the colonies published outraged articles demanding that the act be repealed. And in some colonies, people took more drastic measures. In some cities, merchants met together and formed groups to oppose the Tea Act. These groups, known as the Sons of Liberty, organized protests and boycotts, and in some cases, they even resorted to violence. The Dartmouth arrives. On November 28, 1773, 3 ships arrived in the port of Boston, carrying a total of 92,000 pounds of tea. The ships, the Dartmouth, Eleanor and Beaver, were carrying tea that had been purchased by merchants in the colony of Massachusetts Bay. The problem was that those merchants had purchased the tea before the Tea Act went into effect. Therefore, under the old rules, they could avoid paying the tax on it. Now, this may sound like a small technicality, but it was actually a big deal, because it allowed the merchants to keep their prices low and undercut the British East India Company. Governor Hutchinson stands firm. When Governor Thomas Hutchinson learned that the ships had arrived, he knew he had a problem. He had sworn an oath to uphold the laws of England, and the Tea Act was a law of England. He knew that, if he allowed the ships to unload their cargo, the colonists would see it as a victory for Britain. And with tensions already high, this could be the spark that ignited a full-blown rebellion. On the other hand, if he forced the ships to leave without unloading their cargo, he would be seen as a tyrant who was oppressing the colonists. Either way, he was damned if he did and damned if he didn't. Mass meetings in Boston. As the days passed and Governor Hutchinson remained firm in his decision, the colonists became increasingly angry. On December, massive mass meetings were held in Boston. At the first meeting, 144 delegates from all over New England gathered together to discuss what to do about the tea. After much debate, they decided that the best course of action was to send a petition to the governor asking him to allow the ships to return to England without unloading their cargo. The next day, a second meeting was held, but this time it was a town hall-style meeting open to all male colonists. At this meeting, the men voted to stop buying tea from the British East India Company. They also agreed to send a delegation to the governor asking him to repeal the Tea Act. When the delegation reached the governor, he told them that he would not repeal the Tea Act. He said that he was only following the orders of Parliament and that it was their job to repeal the Act, not his. The colonists were furious. They felt that the governor was a tyrant who was oppressing them, and they were determined to take action. December 16, 1773, the night that changed everything. The night of December 16, 1773, began like any other night in Boston. People went about their daily routines, and no one expected anything out of the ordinary to happen. That all changed around 10 p.m. when a group of colonists snuck onto the docks and boarded the Dartmouth. They were led by John Hancock and Samuel Adams, two members of the Sons of Liberty. At first, the colonists thought that they would be able to unload the tea without anyone noticing. However, they soon realized that this was going to be impossible. The ship's captain, Thomas Coram, and his crew were determined to stop them. The colonists fought back, and eventually they were able to overpower the crew and unload the tea. Once the tea was off the ship, the colonists divided it into smaller heaps and set it on fire. In total, 92,000 pounds of tea went up in flames. The fire burned throughout the night, and by the time it was done, there was nothing left but ashes. A night of silence. As the fire burned and the night wore on, the rest of the city of Boston seemed to fall silent. The people of Boston had been warned not to interfere with the Sons of Liberty, and they took that warning to heart. Even the City Watch, whose job it was to protect the ships, seemed to look the other way. By the time the fire was out and the smoke had cleared, the only sound that could be heard in the streets of Boston was the sound of footsteps. Those footsteps belonged to the Sons of Liberty, and they were the sound of freedom. Britain's furious response. When King George II heard about the Boston Tea Party, he was furious. He felt that the colonists had not only insulted him personally, but they had also insulted the entire British Empire. He demanded that the colony of Massachusetts pay for the cost of the tea, which came to over £1 million in today's money. When the colonists refused, the king got what he wanted. Parliament passed a series of acts, known as the Coercive Acts or the Intolerable Acts, which were designed to punish the colony of Massachusetts and make an example of it for the other colonies. The acts closed the port of Boston until the colonists paid for the tea. They also revoked the Massachusetts Charter, which had given the colony its self-governing status, and they put the colony of Massachusetts under direct British control. The acts also allowed British soldiers to be tried in Britain for crimes committed in the colonies and banned all town meetings in the colonies unless they were sanctioned by the British government. Colonies unite. While the coercive acts were aimed at the colony of Massachusetts, they also had the effect of uniting the other colonies against Britain. The colonists saw the acts as a tyrannical abuse of power, and they began to plan their next move. On September 5, 1774, delegates from all 13 colonies met together in Philadelphia to form the Continental Congress. There they drafted a list of grievances and sent it to King George II. In the list, they demanded that the coercive acts be repealed. When the king refused, the colonists took the next step towards revolution. Was it really a protest about tea? I'm sure by now you're wondering what all this fuss was about tea. After all, it's just tea, right? Well, yes and no. On one hand, it was just tea, but on the other hand, it was more than just tea. You see, the tea was a symbol of everything that the colonists were feeling: frustrated, angry, helpless. The tea was an easy target, something concrete that they could take their frustrations out on. But it was also a symbol of something much bigger: the growing divide between the colonies and Britain. Samuel Adams. When most people think about the Boston Tea Party, they think about Samuel Adams, and rightly so. After all, he was one of the main organizers of the event. But what most people don't realize is that Samuel Adams was not a revolutionary. He was a conservative who simply wanted to preserve the liberties that the colonists had come to enjoy. Samuel Adams was a man of principle who believed in the power of the people. He was also a man of action who was willing to put his money where his mouth was. The British view. From the British perspective, the Boston Tea Party was an act of blatant defiance. The colonists had not only refused to obey the laws of Parliament, they had actively sought to undermine the authority of the government. The British were baffled by the colonists' actions. They couldn't understand why the colonists would throw away perfectly good tea, and they certainly didn't understand why the colonists would risk angering the British government. A spark for revolution. The Boston Tea Party was the event that finally pushed the colonies over the edge and started the American Revolution. The party showed the colonists that they were willing to fight for their rights, and it showed the British that the colonies were not going to be easily subdued. The Boston Tea Party was a turning point in the history of the United States. It was the event that sparked the revolution that led to the creation of a new nation. Why the Tea Party still matters. The Boston Tea Party matters today because it is a reminder of the importance of standing up for what you believe in. The colonists were willing to stand up to the most powerful empire in the world and fight for their rights. They teach us that no matter how powerful the opposition is, we should never give up on our principles. All right, everyone, now it's time for you to tell me what you think. What do you think started the American Revolution? And why do you think the Boston Tea Party happened? Let me know your thoughts down below. And while you're at it, make sure to hit that subscribe button so you never miss an exciting episode. Thanks so much for watching. See you next time.